The retirement home in Charleston, South Carolina was quiet on the afternoon Dr. Emily Richardson arrived to meet its oldest resident. Emily was a history professor at Georgetown University, specializing in the Civil War era and African American resistance movements. She'd received an unusual email from the home's director 3 days earlier. "Professor Richardson, we have a resident here, Mr. James Hamilton, age 98, who claims his grandfather was involved in something extraordinary during slavery times. He's been asking us to find a historian who would take his story seriously. Says it's urgent. Says he's the last person alive who knows the truth." Emily had heard requests like this before. Elderly people often had family stories they wanted validated or recorded before they died. Most were exaggerations or misremembered tales that couldn't be verified. But something in the director's voice had compelled Emily to make the trip from Washington. James Hamilton sat in a wheelchair by the window, afternoon sunlight illuminating his weathered brown face. Despite his age, his eyes were sharp and focused. He studied Emily carefully as she entered. "You're the professor," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, sir." "Emily Richardson. The director said you wanted to speak with a historian." "Not just any historian. Someone who won't dismiss what I'm about to tell you as impossible. Someone who understands that during slavery, black people did things, brave things, impossible things, that never made it into the history books." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a worn leather satchel on the table beside him. "My grandfather's story is one of those impossible things." Emily pulled out her recording equipment. "May I record this?" "That's why you're here." "To record it. To make sure it's not lost when I die." James opened the satchel carefully, revealing old photographs, documents yellowed with age, and what looked like a small journal bound in cracked leather. "My grandfather's name was Samuel Washington. And in 1853, he was sold at auction in Savannah, Georgia for $18,000, the highest price ever paid for a male slave in Georgia history." Emily felt a jolt of recognition. She'd read about that auction in her research. It had been widely reported in newspapers of the era because of the unprecedented price. But the records she'd seen had been sparse on details about the man himself, focusing mainly on the spectacle of the sale. "I know about that auction," Emily said carefully. "The historical records say the man was purchased because of his exceptional physical appearance and strength. He was described as remarkably handsome, which is why the price was so high, wealthy plantation owners competing for a prestigious acquisition." James's expression turned complex, part anger, part bitter amusement. "That's what they wrote in the newspapers. That's what they wanted people to believe. But that's not why my grandfather was really worth $18,000. Not even close." He pulled out a photograph from the satchel, faded and cracked, showing a man in his 60s standing proud and dignified. The man's features were striking even in the old photograph: high cheekbones, intelligent eyes, a bearing that suggested strength and dignity. "This is Samuel, taken in 1891. He was 63 years old, 28 years after the war ended. He lived to be 74. And before he died, he told my father the truth about what really happened. About who he really was. About the secret he carried for 14 years that no one, not the man who bought him, not the other enslaved people, not even the Confederate authorities, ever discovered." Emily leaned forward, intrigued despite her scholarly skepticism. "What secret?" James looked directly at her, his ancient eyes fierce. "My grandfather wasn't just an enslaved man. He was a West Point graduate. A trained military officer. And he was working for the Union as a spy years before the Civil War even started." Emily felt her breath catch. If true, this would be one of the most extraordinary stories of the pre-war era. "Mr. Hamilton, that's an incredible claim. West Point didn't admit black students in the 1850s. How could your grandfather have possibly? Because he wasn't black, James interrupted quietly. Not visibly, anyway. He was what they called an octoroon, 1/8 African descent. He could pass for white. And he did pass for white. For 5 years at West Point, nobody knew. He graduated in 1851, commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. And then he did something no one expected, he disappeared. James pulled out a document from the satchel, a photocopy of what appeared to be a West Point graduation record. Emily's hands shook as she examined it. There, in the class of 1851, was a name, Samuel Williamson. The notation beside it read, "Commission declined. Whereabouts unknown after June 1851. Samuel Williamson was his name at West Point, James explained. But that wasn't his real name. His mother was an enslaved woman in Virginia. His father was her owner's son, a white man who'd raped her. When Samuel was born light enough to pass for white, his mother did something desperate and brave. She convinced a sympathetic abolitionist family to take him north and raise him as their adopted son. They changed his name, gave him their name, Williamson. They raised him as white. Educated him as white. Got him into West Point as white. But why would he give up his commission and disappear? Emily asked. Because his mother sent him a message. She was dying, and she wanted to see him one last time. Samuel traveled back to Virginia in secret to say goodbye. And while he was there, his mother told him something that changed everything. She told him he had a younger brother, another light-skinned son of the same white father. A brother who was enslaved on a plantation in Georgia. A brother Samuel had never known existed. James's voice grew heavy with emotion as he continued. Samuel's mother begged him, use his education, use his military training, use everything he'd learned at West Point to help his people. Not just his brother, but all enslaved people. She said God had given him advantages most black people could never have. He had knowledge, skills, and the ability to move in white society. He had to use those advantages to fight slavery. So he went to Georgia to find his brother. More than that. He developed a plan, an audacious, dangerous plan that would take years to execute. He would have himself sold into slavery intentionally. He'd use his light skin, his education, his physical appearance to get purchased by a wealthy, influential plantation owner. And then he'd gather intelligence, organize resistance networks, and prepare for the war he knew was coming. He'd be a spy, operating behind enemy lines years before there were official enemy lines. Emily felt goosebumps rising on her arms. How did he get himself sold into slavery? And why would anyone pay $18,000 for him if they knew he'd been a free man, let alone a military officer? They didn't know, James said. That was the genius of it. Samuel created an entirely new identity. He darkened his skin slightly, spent months in the sun, used certain herbs and compounds to darken his complexion just enough that he'd be accepted as a light-skinned enslaved person rather than a white man. He created documents showing he'd been born enslaved in Virginia, that his owner had recently died, and the estate was being settled. He even arranged his own kidnapping. His own kidnapping? James nodded. In 1852, Samuel hired men, actual slave catchers, to capture him as a runaway slave. He had forged papers showing he was valuable property fleeing to the north. The slave catchers believed they'd caught a genuine fugitive. They brought him to Savannah to be sold, expecting to collect a finder's fee. And when Samuel was put on the auction block, he was so striking, so unusual, so clearly different from typical enslaved men that the bidding went wild. James pulled out a newspaper clipping from March 1853. The headline read, "Record-breaking sale, most handsome Negro ever sold in Savannah." The article described Samuel in terms that made Emily's stomach turn, describing him like a prize horse, noting his classical features, his unusual bearing, his exceptional physique. The article said he'd been purchased by Richard Hartwell, one of the wealthiest plantation owners in Georgia. Richard Hartwell paid $18,000 thinking he was buying a prestigious acquisition, a slave so remarkable that owning him would enhance Hartwell's social standing, James explained. He had no idea he was actually purchasing a trained military intelligence officer who was about to turn his plantation into a center of underground resistance. Emily sat back, her mind reeling. If this story was true, and the documents James was showing her suggested it might be, it would completely rewrite the understanding of pre-war resistance and intelligence gathering. Mr. Hamilton, this is extraordinary. But I need to understand, how do you know all this? And why has this story never been told before? James's expression grew sad. My grandfather kept the secret his entire life. Even after the war ended, even after slavery was abolished, he never told anyone except his son, my father, and he only told him on his deathbed in 1902. My grandfather was afraid. Afraid that former Confederates would seek revenge if they knew they'd been deceived so completely. Afraid that even in freedom, the truth might put his family in danger. But you're telling it now. Why? Because I'm 98 years old. Because I'm the last person alive who knows. Because my grandfather was a hero who risked everything to fight slavery, and he's been written about in history books as just another enslaved man, notable only because he was handsome and sold for a high price. That's wrong. That's erasing his real legacy, his courage, his intelligence, his sacrifice. James reached out and gripped Emily's hand with surprising strength. My grandfather spent 14 years enslaved, 14 years, gathering intelligence, organizing resistance, preparing people for freedom. He did it knowing he could never reveal his true identity, never claim credit for his work, never be recognized for his sacrifice. And when the war ended and he was freed, he had to continue the deception. He couldn't tell anyone he'd been to West Point because Southern whites would have killed him for uppity behavior. He couldn't tell other black people because they wouldn't have believed him, or worse, they might have resented him for having passed as white when so many others couldn't. So he just lived quietly. Kept the secret. He became a teacher. Opened a school for freed people in Savannah after the war. Taught hundreds of children to read and write. Used his West Point education to give others the knowledge he'd acquired. But he did it all under the identity of Samuel Washington, formerly enslaved, with no one knowing about Samuel Williamson, West Point graduate, or the incredible deception he'd maintained for so many years. James pulled out the leather journal. This is his journal. He kept it hidden his entire life, written in code so that if it was discovered during slavery, no one would understand what it really said. After the war, he kept it hidden because he was still afraid of retaliation. He gave it to my father on his deathbed, and my father gave it to me. I've spent 60 years protecting it, waiting for the right time to reveal it. I think that time is now. Emily's hands trembled as she opened the journal. The pages were filled with writing, some in clear English, some in what appeared to be cipher. As she flipped through, she saw sketches of plantation layouts, notes about patrol schedules, names and notes that appeared to track enslaved people and their families. This is the journal of an intelligence officer, Emily whispered. These are reconnaissance notes, tactical observations, strategic planning. My grandfather turned the Hartwell plantation into an intelligence hub, James said. He used his position, Hartwell trusted him, gave him responsibilities managing other enslaved people, to gather information and organize resistance. He taught literacy in secret. He mapped escape routes. He coordinated with Underground Railroad conductors. And he prepared people for the war he knew was coming. Emily looked up from the journal, her scholarly skepticism warring with the evidence before her. "Mr. Hamilton, if I'm going to tell this story, I'll need to verify everything. I'll need to confirm the West Point records, track the auction documentation, corroborate the timeline, find independent evidence that supports these claims. I know. That's why I've waited for the right historian. Someone who'll do the work properly, who'll verify before broadcasting, who'll tell the truth but tell it responsibly." James looked at her intently. "But I also need you to understand something. This story involves powerful families, descendants of the Hartwells and others who profited from slavery. Some of those families are still influential in Georgia and South Carolina. They've spent generations building respectable reputations and distancing themselves from their slavery history. If you expose the truth about how completely they were deceived by my grandfather, if you show that a black man outsmarted and outmaneuvered them for years while they thought they owned him, they won't like it. Are you saying this could be dangerous? I'm saying powerful people don't like being embarrassed, especially when it challenges the narratives they've built about their families. But that's not a reason to stay silent. Truth matters more than comfort. Justice matters more than reputation." Emily spent the next 4 hours with James, going through every document in his possession, recording his testimony, taking photographs of the journal and papers. By the time she left Charleston that evening, her head was spinning with the implications of what she'd learned. If James Hamilton's story was true, if Samuel Washington had really been Samuel Williamson, a West Point graduate who deliberately entered slavery as a spy, it would be one of the most remarkable stories of courage and deception in American history. But it would also challenge deeply held narratives about slavery, about resistance, about the capabilities and agency of enslaved people. It would expose how completely some enslaved people had deceived their owners. And it would embarrass powerful families whose ancestors had been outmaneuvered by a man they believed they owned. Emily drove back to Washington knowing she was about to embark on the most important and potentially dangerous research project of her career. She would verify James Hamilton's claims. She would track down every piece of evidence. She would be meticulous and careful and responsible. But she would also tell the truth. Because Samuel Washington, or Samuel Williamson, or whatever his real name had been, deserved to have his story told. He deserved to be remembered not as a gorgeous male slave sold for a record price, but as the military intelligence officer and freedom fighter he'd really been. The impossible secret was beginning to emerge. And nothing would ever be the same. Emily spent the next 6 weeks conducting research that would either validate or disprove James Hamilton's extraordinary claims. She started with the West Point records, traveling to the military academy's archives in New York. The archivist, an elderly man named Dr. Gerald Foster, was initially skeptical when Emily explained what she was looking for. "We have complete records of every graduate," Foster said. "If this Samuel Williamson existed, we'll have his file. But Professor Richardson, I should warn you, we've had researchers come here before with family legends about secret black graduates in the 1850s. None have ever been verified." But when Foster pulled up the file for Samuel Williamson, class of 1851, Emily's breath caught. The record was sparse but real. Samuel Williamson had attended West Point from 1847 to 1851, graduating 23rd in a class of 42. His record noted he'd been an excellent student in engineering and tactics. And there was a notation that Emily found chilling: commission declined June 1851. Subject departed the academy. No forwarding address provided. Efforts to locate failed. "This is unusual," Foster admitted, studying the file. Most graduates either accepted their commissions or had documented reasons for declining. Williamson just disappeared. The academy tried to find him for 2 years. There are notes here showing they sent letters to the address he provided, but all came back undeliverable. It was as if he'd vanished. "Is there a photograph?" Emily asked. Foster shook his head. Daguerreotypes weren't common at the Academy until the late 1850s. We don't have images of most graduates from 1851. But we do have this. He pulled out a physical description from the enrollment records: height, 6 feet 1 inch. Build, athletic. Complexion, fair. Hair, dark brown. Eyes, hazel. Distinguishing marks, small scar above right eyebrow. Emily's heart raced. The description matched what James Hamilton had told her about his grandfather. And fair complexion would be consistent with someone light-skinned enough to pass for white. Dr. Foster, is there any way to determine if Samuel Williamson might have had African ancestry? Foster looked uncomfortable. West Point didn't officially admit black students until the 1870s. But he lowered his voice. There have been rumors for years that some light-skinned black men may have attended the academy before then by passing as white. No confirmed cases, just rumors. If Williamson was one of them, and if he disappeared to avoid being exposed, that would explain the unusual circumstances of his departure. Emily's next stop was Savannah, where she spent 2 weeks in historical archives researching the 1853 auction. She found extensive documentation, newspaper articles, auction house records, even personal letters from people who'd attended the sale. The auction had indeed been a major event. The newspaper descriptions of Samuel were disturbing in their objectification, describing him as the most handsome Negro ever offered for sale in Savannah, with features so refined and bearing so dignified that one might mistake him for a white man of good breeding in darker skin. But Emily found something else in the records, something that supported James Hamilton's story. The auction documents listed Samuel's previous owner as estate of Robert Williamson, deceased, of Richmond, Virginia. Emily traveled to Richmond and searched estate records. She found Robert Williamson's estate settlement from 1852. But the documents showed no enslaved person named Samuel listed among the property. In fact, Robert Williamson had died with only 6 enslaved people, all accounted for and sold locally in Richmond. This was the first hard evidence that Samuel's backstory at the Savannah auction had been fabricated. He hadn't actually been part of any estate settlement. Someone had forged documents to create a false identity for him. Emily found more evidence in arrest records from 1852. There had been an incident involving slave catchers claiming to have apprehended a fugitive slave of exceptional appearance and bearing, near the Virginia-North Carolina border. The man had been brought to Savannah and sold at auction after no owner came forward to claim him. Everything lined up with James Hamilton's account. Samuel had arranged his own capture, complete with forged documents establishing his identity as enslaved property. But Emily needed proof connecting Samuel Williamson to Samuel Washington, proof that they were the same person. She found it in an unexpected place. At the Freedmen's Bureau archives in Washington, D.C., Emily discovered records from the school Samuel Washington had founded in Savannah after the war. Among the documents was an application for federal funding, dated 1866. On the application, Samuel Washington had to provide information about his education and qualifications to teach. Under education, Samuel had written, self-taught during enslavement, with additional private study of mathematics, engineering, and military history. But there was a notation on the application in a different hand, apparently from the Freedmen's Bureau officer who'd interviewed him. Applicant's knowledge seems far beyond self-teaching. Particularly sophisticated understanding of military tactics and engineering. When questioned, became evasive about source of knowledge. Approved funding based on demonstrated competence regardless of unclear educational background. Emily also found testimony from Samuel's students and colleagues. Multiple people had noted that he seemed to have unusually advanced knowledge for someone who claimed to be self-taught during slavery. One former student, writing in 1897, said, "Mr. Washington knew things no enslaved person should have been able to learn. We all wondered where his knowledge came from, but he would never tell us." He would just smile and say he'd been blessed with good teachers. The pieces were coming together. Samuel Williamson had become Samuel Washington. The West Point graduate had maintained his cover so completely that even people who knew him well couldn't figure out his real background. But Emily needed one more piece of evidence, something directly connecting the two identities. She found it in the journal James Hamilton had shown her. Emily had the journal analyzed by experts in 19th-century handwriting and document authentication. The results were conclusive. The journal was genuine, dating from the 1850s and 1860s, written by the same person throughout. And when the cipher portions were decoded using techniques common to military intelligence of that era, they revealed detailed intelligence reports. The journal entries described patrol patterns, documented conversations among white people discussing military preparations, tracked weapons and ammunition supplies on the Hartwell plantation, and outlined escape routes with a precision that could only come from someone with military training. One entry from 1859 made Emily's hands shake as she read it. March 17, 1859, 6 years since arriving at Hartwell Plantation. Have successfully maintained cover. No one suspects my true background or purpose. Have established education networks across 3 counties. Taught 127 people to read using clandestine methods. Mapped all major plantations within 50 miles. Identified 23 potential recruits for future military operations. Coordinated safe passage to freedom for 41 people via the Underground Railroad. All intelligence reports forwarded to Northern contacts as planned. The weight of this deception grows heavier each day. To be treated as property when I know myself to be free. To bow my head when I want to stand tall. To pretend ignorance when I hold advanced education. But the mission is larger than my pride or comfort. Every person I help escape, every child I teach to read, every piece of intelligence I gather, these justify the sacrifice. Emily had the handwriting analyzed again, comparing it to Samuel Williamson's West Point records. The experts couldn't make a definitive match. The West Point samples were too limited, but they noted significant similarities in letter formation, particularly in technical terms and numbers. After 3 months of research, Emily had built a compelling case. Not absolute proof, that might be impossible given how much Samuel had worked to hide his tracks, but enough corroborating evidence that his story deserved to be told and taken seriously. She was preparing to write up her findings when she received a phone call that changed everything. Professor Richardson. This is Malcolm Hartwell. I understand you've been researching my family's history. Emily's blood ran cold. The Hartwells were still one of the most prominent families in Georgia, with significant wealth and political connections. Mr. Hartwell, I'm conducting academic research into slavery era. I know what you're researching, Malcolm interrupted, his voice cold. You've been in Savannah looking at auction records involving my great-great-great-grandfather Richard Hartwell. You've been asking questions about a slave he purchased in 1853. I want to know why. It's historical research, Mr. Hartwell. Part of my work as a historian. Let me be direct, Professor. My family has worked very hard to establish a respected reputation in Georgia. We've donated millions to universities, hospitals, and civil rights organizations. We've publicly acknowledged our family's complicated history with slavery and expressed remorse. What we don't need is some professor digging up sensational stories that make my ancestors look foolish or incompetent. I'm not trying to make anyone look foolish. I'm trying to tell the truth about a remarkable man who has been erased from history. The man you're researching, Samuel Washington, was a slave my ancestor owned. That's unfortunate, but it's historical fact. What I won't tolerate is some narrative suggesting he was secretly some kind of spy or military officer who deceived my family. That's not just bad history, it's defamatory to the Hartwell name. Mr. Hartwell, I have extensive documentation supporting. I don't care what documentation you think you have. My family has attorneys who specialize in protecting our reputation. If you publish anything suggesting the Hartwells were deceived or made fools of, if you suggest a slave outsmarted my ancestors, we will sue you and your university. Do you understand? The line went dead. Emily sat shaking, anger and fear warring in her chest. The Hartwell family had just threatened her explicitly. They had the resources to bury her in lawsuits, to damage her career, to make her research impossible to publish. But she thought about Samuel Washington spending 14 years enslaved, never revealing his true identity, never claiming credit for his courage and intelligence. She thought about James Hamilton, 98 years old and desperate to have his grandfather's true story told before dying. She couldn't let wealthy families continue to control the narrative about their own history. The truth mattered more than their reputation. Emily reached out to her network of historians and civil rights scholars, explaining what she'd found and the threats she was facing. To her relief and gratitude, many rallied to support her. Prominent historians reviewed her research and confirmed its credibility. Civil rights organizations offered legal support if the Hartwells followed through on their threats. And then Emily received an unexpected email from someone named Patricia Hartwell Chen. Professor Richardson, I'm Malcolm Hartwell's cousin. We've never met, but I've heard about your research. I'd like to meet with you if possible. I have information that might help your work. They met at a coffee shop in Atlanta 3 days later. Patricia was in her 50s, a lawyer who'd spent her career working on civil rights cases. She looked nothing like what Emily had expected from a Hartwell family member. I need you to understand something, Patricia began. Not all of us agree with Malcolm's approach to family history. Some of us believe the truth should come out, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes us. Why are you here? Patricia pulled out a folder. Because my grandmother left me something. She died in 2003, and in her will, she left me a metal box she'd kept hidden for decades. Inside was a letter written by Richard Hartwell in 1863, my great-great-great-grandfather, the man who purchased Samuel Washington at that auction. Emily's hands trembled as Patricia passed her a photocopy of the letter. Who was this letter written to? Richard's wife, Caroline. He'd gone to join Confederate forces, and he wrote to her explaining things he'd discovered. Things that made him question everything he thought he knew. Emily read the letter, dated November 1863. My dearest Caroline. I write to you from camp with a heavy heart and troubled mind. I must confess something that has been weighing on me since I departed home. It concerns Samuel, the slave I purchased for such an extraordinary sum 10 years ago. I have always prided myself on being an astute judge of human character and value. I believed Samuel was exceptional, handsome, intelligent, capable, but still ultimately just property, albeit extraordinary property. But I have come to suspect I was deceived in ways I cannot fully admit even to myself. Samuel's knowledge always seemed unusual. His bearing was too refined. His intelligence too sharp. I attributed this to fortunate breeding, a light-skinned slave from a good Virginia family. But there were signs I ignored or explained away. He could read, truly read, not just recognize a few words but read with comprehension and speed that suggested extensive education. He understood engineering principles I would have needed university training to grasp. He knew military tactics that seemed impossible for a slave to have learned. I am afraid, Caroline, that Samuel was not what he seemed. I believe, and it pains me to write this, that he may have been a free man who was captured and sold into slavery, or perhaps even someone who entered slavery with deliberate purpose. I believe he spent 10 years on our plantation gathering information, organizing our slaves, and preparing for rebellion or escape. When he disappeared 2 months ago with 47 of our slaves, everyone assumed it was opportunistic flight during wartime chaos. But I wonder now if it was the culmination of a plan years in the making. I wonder if Samuel was a soldier, perhaps even a Union agent, who spent a decade behind enemy lines preparing for this war. If I am right, then I, and all of us who knew Samuel, were deceived in the most complete and humiliating way imaginable. We thought we owned him. We thought ourselves his masters. But if my suspicions are correct, he was always free in his mind, always working against us, always 3 steps ahead of our understanding. I cannot prove these suspicions. Perhaps I do not want to prove them, for the humiliation would be too great. But I needed to confess them to someone, and you are the only person I trust with such thoughts. Destroy this letter after reading it. The implications are too damaging if they became known. Your devoted husband, Richard. Emily looked up at Patricia, tears in her eyes. This is it. This is the confirmation I needed. Richard Hartwell suspected the truth. My grandmother kept this letter secret her entire life, Patricia said. She believed it was shameful, proof that our family had been made fools of. But I don't see it that way. I see it as proof that an enslaved man was so brilliant, so courageous, so capable that he deceived his owner completely while fighting for freedom. That's not shameful for our family, that's a testament to Samuel Washington's extraordinary abilities. Why are you showing me this? Malcolm made it clear your family doesn't want this story told. Malcolm doesn't speak for all of us. Some of us believe that confronting the truth about slavery, including uncomfortable truths about how enslaved people resisted and deceived their owners, is the only way to truly reckon with our history. Samuel Washington deserves to be honored for what he really was. And our family deserves to have the truth known, even if it's uncomfortable. Patricia leaned forward. Professor Richardson, please tell this story. Tell it completely and honestly. My family may threaten you. Malcolm has money and lawyers. But some of us will support you. And the truth matters more than the Hartwell family's comfort. Emily spent the next 4 months writing her research paper. She documented everything meticulously, including Richard Hartwell's letter, the West Point records, the auction documentation, and James Hamilton's testimony. She had the work peer-reviewed by 5 prominent historians before submitting it for publication. The paper was titled, The Impossible Deception, Samuel Washington, West Point graduate and Union intelligence agent operating in slavery. When it was published in the Journal of American History, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Some historians praised it as groundbreaking research that expanded understanding of pre-war intelligence operations and enslaved people's sophisticated resistance. Others questioned whether the evidence was sufficient to make such extraordinary claims. The Hartwell family, as threatened, filed a lawsuit claiming defamation. But with Patricia Hartwell Chen's support and the backing of civil rights organizations, Emily had the resources to fight back. The case was eventually dismissed when Emily demonstrated that everything in her paper was supported by documentary evidence. But the most meaningful response came from a phone call Emily received 3 weeks after publication. Professor Richardson. This is James Hamilton. I saw your paper. You did it. You told the truth about my grandfather. Mr. Hamilton, I'm so glad you called. I've been wanting to update you. I'm in the hospital, James interrupted gently. Pneumonia. The doctors say I don't have much time. But I needed to call you before I go. I needed to tell you thank you. Emily felt tears streaming down her face. You don't need to thank me. Your grandfather's story deserved to be told. He was a hero, James said, his voice weak but proud. A real hero. Not because he was handsome or because he sold for a high price, but because he risked everything to fight slavery. Because he used his mind as a weapon when he had no other weapons. Because he never gave up, never revealed his secret, never stopped fighting. And now, finally, people know. They know the truth. James Hamilton died 2 days later, peacefully in his sleep. Emily attended his funeral in Charleston, where she met distant relatives who'd never known the full story of their ancestor until her paper was published. At the funeral, Patricia Hartwell Chen stood beside Emily. "You did the right thing," Patricia said quietly. "The truth is out now. It can never be hidden again." Emily thought about Samuel Washington, Samuel Williamson, the West Point graduate who'd deliberately entered slavery as an intelligence officer, who'd maintained his cover for 14 years, who'd helped dozens of people escape to freedom and prepared hundreds more for the war that would finally end slavery. He'd been mocked and underestimated, seen as just another enslaved man, notable only for his appearance. He'd faced cruelty and injustice every day of his enslaved life. But he'd risen with courage and resilience that most people could never comprehend. And now, 171 years after he'd stood on that auction block in Savannah, his true story was finally known. The impossible secret had been revealed. And justice, delayed but real, had finally been served. 3 months after Emily's paper was published, she received an invitation that surprised her. The U.S. Army wanted to officially recognize Samuel Williamson's service and posthumously restore his commission as a second lieutenant. The ceremony was held at West Point in November 2024. Emily stood on the academy grounds where Samuel had studied 173 years earlier, surrounded by military officials, historians, and descendants of people Samuel had helped escape from slavery. A general in full-dress uniform addressed the crowd. "For too long, Lieutenant Samuel Williamson's service to his country has gone unrecognized. He graduated from this academy in 1851, then undertook one of the most dangerous and difficult missions any soldier has ever accepted, to operate undercover behind enemy lines for 14 years, without support, without recognition, without the ability to reveal his true identity. His courage and sacrifice exemplify the highest traditions of military service." The Army presented a posthumous commendation and formally restored Samuel's commission to the record books. His name would now appear in the Academy's Hall of Honor, with a plaque explaining his extraordinary service. But for Emily, the most meaningful part of the ceremony came afterward, when descendants of the people Samuel had helped save gathered to share their family stories. An elderly woman named Dorothy Freeman stood to speak. "My great-great-grandfather was named Thomas. He was enslaved on the Hartwell plantation. He wrote in his journal that a man he knew only as Samuel taught him to read in secret, at night, risking severe punishment if they were caught. My great-great-grandfather used that ability to read to navigate his way to freedom in 1863. He made it to Pennsylvania, where he established a school for freed people. That school still exists today as a community center in Philadelphia. None of that would have been possible without the man we now know was Lieutenant Samuel Williamson." Another descendant, a professor named Marcus Webb, shared his story. "Samuel Washington, Williamson, helped my ancestor escape in 1862, during the chaos of war. He gave her a map, supplies, and detailed instructions about safe houses along the route north. My ancestor was 8 months pregnant at the time. Samuel told her, 'Your child will be born free. Make sure they never forget the price that was paid for that freedom.' My family has never forgotten. And now we know the full price Lieutenant Williamson paid, 14 years of his life spent enslaved, pretending, deceiving, all to help people like my ancestor escape." But the ceremony also attracted protesters. Members of heritage groups and descendants of Confederate families gathered outside the academy, carrying signs claiming Emily's research was revisionist history meant to make Southerners look bad. Malcolm Hartwell was among them, giving interviews to reporters. "This whole thing is a farce." Professor Richardson found some circumstantial evidence and built a fantasy around it. "There's no definitive proof that Samuel Washington was this Samuel Williamson character. She's invented a hero to push a political agenda." A reporter thrust a microphone at Emily as she left the ceremony. "Professor Richardson, how do you respond to claims that your research is politically motivated? Emily took a deep breath, thinking about her responsibility to tell the truth carefully but firmly. I stand by my research completely. Multiple historians have reviewed my work and confirmed its credibility. We have West Point records showing Samuel Williamson attended the academy and disappeared under mysterious circumstances. We have auction records showing a man matching his description sold in Savannah. We have his personal journal documenting intelligence-gathering activities. We have testimony from dozens of descendants of people he helped. And we have a letter from Richard Hartwell himself expressing suspicions about Samuel's true identity. That's not circumstantial, that's documented history. But why has this story never been told before? Because Samuel Williamson maintained his cover for his entire life. Even after slavery ended, even after the war, he never revealed his true identity. He was afraid, rightfully, that former Confederates would seek revenge if they knew how completely they'd been deceived. He protected himself and his family by keeping the secret. It's only now, through the courage of his last surviving descendant and the documentary evidence that's been preserved, that we can finally tell the full truth. The reporter turned to Malcolm Hartwell. Mr. Hartwell, what do you say to the descendants who claim Samuel Williamson helped their ancestors escape from your family's plantation? Malcolm's face reddened. I say they're misremembering or exaggerating. Family stories get embellished over generations. Just because people want to believe something doesn't make it true. But then Patricia Hartwell Chen stepped forward. Malcolm, enough. The truth is the truth. Our great-great-great-grandfather's own letter confirms he suspected Samuel was deceiving him. Other plantation records show organized escapes that required coordination and intelligence Samuel provided. You're embarrassed that our ancestor was outsmarted by an enslaved man. But that embarrassment is yours to deal with. It doesn't change the historical facts. The confrontation between the two Hartwell cousins became national news. It sparked broader conversations about how families dealt with slavery history, whether to deny and minimize, or to acknowledge and learn from uncomfortable truths. 2 weeks after the West Point ceremony, Emily was invited to speak at a symposium on slavery and resistance at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The auditorium was packed with historians, students, and descendants of enslaved people. Emily stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, and began her presentation. Samuel Williamson was mocked and underestimated his entire life. White people saw him as property, notable only for his appearance. They thought they owned him. They thought they controlled him. They had no idea they were housing a trained military officer who was gathering intelligence and organizing resistance right under their noses. Even other enslaved people didn't know the full truth about him. They knew he was educated, they knew he helped people escape, they knew he was different. But they didn't know he'd been to West Point. They didn't know he deliberately entered slavery as an intelligence officer. They couldn't have known, because revealing that truth would have gotten everyone killed. Samuel faced cruelty and injustice every single day for 14 years. He was whipped when he was caught teaching people to read. He was threatened when enslaved people he'd helped escape were discovered. He watched people he cared about be sold away, be brutalized, be broken by the system he was fighting against. And he couldn't reveal his true identity, couldn't call on his military training openly, couldn't claim the respect he deserved as an educated officer. But he rose above all of it with courage and resilience that most of us can't comprehend. He maintained his cover. He continued his mission. He saved lives and prepared people for freedom. And he did it knowing he'd never receive recognition, never be honored, never be able to claim credit for his work. That's the definition of a hero, someone who does the right thing even when no one will ever know, even when there's no reward, even when the cost is enormous. Emily clicked to the next slide, showing the photograph of Samuel in 1891. This is Samuel in his 60s, nearly 30 years after the war. He looks proud and dignified. He'd survived. He'd lived to see slavery end. He'd taught hundreds of children in the school he founded. But he was still carrying the secret. Still protecting himself and his family by never revealing the full truth. James Hamilton, Samuel's grandson, told me something before he died. He said his grandfather had nightmares until the day he died. Dreams about being back on the auction block, being sold, being owned. The trauma of those 14 years never fully healed. Even in freedom, the memory of being treated as property haunted him. But James also said his grandfather never regretted his choice. Never wished he'd stayed safely in the North instead of entering slavery as a spy. Because those 14 years, as terrible as they were, allowed him to save hundreds of people. Every person he taught to read, every person he helped escape, every piece of intelligence he gathered that would eventually help the Union win the war, all of that justified the sacrifice. Emily's voice grew stronger as she reached her conclusion. Samuel Williamson's story has been hidden for 171 years. But now it's out. Now we know the truth. And that truth changes how we understand slavery, resistance, and courage. Enslaved people weren't passive victims waiting to be saved. They were active resistors who fought with every tool available to them, including sophisticated deception, intelligence gathering, and long-term strategic planning. Samuel Williamson proved that enslaved people could outthink, outmaneuver, and ultimately outlast the system designed to crush them. And families like the Hartwells, who profited from slavery, need to confront the uncomfortable truth that they were deceived. They thought they were masters. They thought they controlled everything. But they were being fought against every single day by people they underestimated, people whose intelligence and courage they could never comprehend. That's the real legacy of Samuel Williamson. Not that he was handsome or that he sold for a high price. But that he was a soldier who fought an unconventional war with the weapons available to him, his mind, his education, his ability to deceive and resist. And he won. The applause was thunderous. After her presentation, Emily was approached by dozens of people, historians who wanted to collaborate on further research, descendants who had their own family stories about people Samuel had helped, and students who were inspired by this hidden history. But the most meaningful encounter came from an unexpected source. A young woman in her 20s approached Emily nervously. "Professor Richardson. My name is Amanda Williamson. I think Samuel might have been my ancestor too." Emily's breath caught. "What makes you think that?" Amanda pulled out an old photograph. "This is my great-great-great-grandfather, also named Samuel. Family legend says he came from Georgia, that he'd been enslaved but escaped during the war. The timing matches your research. And look at this." She showed Emily a faded document, a marriage certificate from 1866 showing Samuel Williamson marrying a woman named Rebecca in Philadelphia. "After the war, Lieutenant Williamson went north," Emily said slowly. "The records show he spent several years in Pennsylvania before returning south to teach. If he married during that time and started a family, then I might be descended from him," Amanda finished. "Professor Richardson, I've spent my whole life knowing my ancestor had been enslaved and escaped, but knowing nothing else about him. If he's really Lieutenant Samuel Williamson, if he's really the hero you've been researching, then I need to know. I need to understand where I come from." Over the next months, Emily worked with Amanda to research her family tree. DNA testing and genealogical records eventually confirmed what they'd suspected: Amanda Williamson was indeed descended from Lieutenant Samuel Williamson. He'd married and had 3 children during his time in Philadelphia, then later returned south alone. His wife had died in childbirth in 1870, to establish his school in Savannah. This meant Samuel had 2 separate family lines, the one that led to James Hamilton through children born after he returned to Georgia, and the one that led to Amanda through his earlier marriage in Philadelphia. The discovery brought together descendants who'd never known of each other's existence. At a family reunion held in Savannah in 2025, over 60 descendants of Samuel Williamson gathered to honor their ancestor and learn his true story. An elderly man named Robert Hamilton, James's nephew, stood to speak. "My Uncle James spent his whole life protecting this secret and waiting for the right time to reveal it. He died knowing the truth would finally be told." Looking around this room, seeing how many of us exist because Lieutenant Williamson had the courage to survive those 14 years of slavery, I think Uncle James would be proud. This is his legacy, all of us, living free, gathered to honor the man who risked everything so we could exist. The reunion was covered by national news outlets, sparking broader conversations about hidden history and the sophisticated resistance networks enslaved people had built. Historians began looking for other cases of free black people who might have deliberately entered slavery as spies or organizers. Several potential cases were identified for further research. But controversy continued. The Hartwell family, or at least Malcolm's branch, never accepted the story. They continued to claim Emily's research was flawed and politically motivated. But as more evidence emerged and more historians validated the findings, their objections became increasingly isolated. Other descendants of slave-owning families had different reactions. Some, like Patricia Hartwell Chen, embraced the truth and used it to prompt deeper conversations about slavery and its legacy. Others remained in denial, unable to accept that their ancestors had been so completely deceived. A year after Emily's initial paper was published, she completed a full-length book titled The Impossible Secret, Lieutenant Samuel Williamson and the Hidden War Against Slavery. The book became a bestseller, taught in universities across the country, and eventually adapted into a documentary film. At the book launch in Washington, D.C., Emily dedicated the work to James Hamilton and all the descendants of people Samuel Williamson had helped save. "This story almost died with James Hamilton," Emily told the crowd. "It almost remained hidden forever. But James had the courage to reveal it, knowing it might be controversial, knowing powerful families wouldn't want it told. He understood that truth matters more than comfort. That justice matters more than reputation. That a hero deserves to be honored for what they really did, not dismissed as just another enslaved person whose only notable quality was physical appearance." Lieutenant Samuel Williamson spent 14 years being underestimated, mocked, and dismissed as property. But he was always free in his mind. He was always a soldier fighting a war his enemies didn't even know existed. And he won. His story is finally told. His legacy is finally honored. And the impossible secret is secret no more. Emily looked out at the crowd and saw Amanda Williamson standing beside Patricia Hartwell Chen, a descendant of the man who'd fought slavery and a descendant of the family that had enslaved him, standing together to honor the truth. That image, more than anything else, represented what Emily had been fighting for. Not to embarrass families or stir up controversy, but to ensure that truth and justice prevailed over comfortable lies and convenient erasures. Samuel Williamson, Samuel Washington, the gorgeous male slave who'd been sold for a record price in Savannah in 1853, was finally recognized for what he really was, Lieutenant Samuel Williamson, West Point graduate, Union intelligence officer, freedom fighter, and hero. The man who'd been mocked had been vindicated. The man who'd faced injustice had received justice. The man who'd been enslaved had proven that no chains could bind a mind determined to be free. And 171 years after standing on that auction block, wearing invisible chains while carrying secret knowledge that would help destroy slavery itself, Samuel Williamson had finally taken his rightful place in history. Not as property. Not as a curiosity. But as one of the bravest and most remarkable soldiers America had ever produced. The impossible secret was revealed. The truth was told. Justice was served. And Samuel Williamson's courage would inspire generations to come, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, even when facing impossible odds, resistance is possible. Freedom is achievable. And truth, no matter how long delayed, will eventually prevail. Asterisk note, this story is fiction inspired by the real courage of enslaved people who resisted their bondage through intelligence, deception, and strategic planning. While Samuel Williamson is a fictional character, his story represents the countless unnamed heroes who fought slavery in ways that were never recorded or recognized. Their courage and sacrifice deserve to be remembered and honored. Asterisk.